sneaking up on you.
On behalf of the American Association of Geographers, I'm delighted to present this year's Honorary Geographer Award to author, activist, and historian Rebecca Solnit. Thank you. Where is she? Is it in the podium? There it is. Thank you. Should I bring? Thank you. Thank you. You want a picture with the... Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much. And also, last time I was looking around this room, there was about a third as many people, so it is very exciting to see you all show up. I am honored, and I'm so honored by this award, and so thrilled to be hanging out with geographers. There was a long period where I thought I was going to go back and get a PhD, and mostly was going to be a PhD in geography. I even asked Dick Walker at Berkeley to recruit me, which he didn't. And but I never stopped writing long enough to go do anything else, and now it feels like it's sort of too late. But you know, instead I've moved in on you all by osmosis and association with cartographers, and now this award, and thank you so much. So, in my book Wanderlust, A History of Walking, that came out, God, 23 years ago, I said of walking, you know, if a field of expertise can be imagined as an actual field, because I'm always making metaphors literal again, kind of hedged around, probably rectangular, etc., then walking trespasses across many fields and tracing what it is that we might want to know about it. And I think I love geography partly because it's either an incredibly large field or a field that trespasses across a lot of hedges and fences and borders in its sort of vast encompassing of so many crucial things. I deeply believe that a lot of what we need to know often is patterns and relationships that exist across larger spaces than kind of the narrow focus and specialization can bring together. And I think that drives a lot of my work, which whatever else it does, most definitely meanders. Now let's see if I'm competent to do these slides. Oh, look, I did it. Amazing. So in my book, The Faraway Nearby, I wrote about talking to a group of students in Southern California, a working class college, long ago, during a hard time in my own life. And I wrote about that, saying, I talked about places, about the ways that we often talk about love of place, by which we mean our love for places, but seldom of how places love us back, of what they give us. They give us continuity, something to return to, something to observe, offer familiarity that allows some portion of our own lives to remain connected and coherent. When other aspects of a life become wildly uncertain, to know the trail or boulevard, the names of the flowers and streets, the hour of moonrise, the return of the seasons, the shape of a ridgeline, the sound of the river, or the location of the nightclub, and to know that they're there is reassurance. And of course I wrote that and I'm just reading it, I'm like, that was a while ago. Now we know so many of those things are not so stable, and between gentrification and climate change, but going on. They gave us an expansive scale in which our troubles are set and into context, in which the largeness of the world is a balm to loss, trouble and ugliness. I used to go to Ocean Beach, I wrote, and this is Ocean Beach at dawn on the first day of crab season in November of 2021, taken with an iPhone. So it really is that pretty. I didn't do anything to it except point a phone at it. I used to go to Ocean Beach, the long strip of sand facing the churning Pacific at the end of my own city, for reinforcement, and it always put things in perspective, a term that can be literal too. The city turned into sand, and the sand into surf, and the surf into ocean, and just to know that the ocean went on for many thousands of miles was to know that there was an outer border to my own story, and even to human stories, and that something else picked up beyond. It was the familiar edge of the unknown, forever licking at the shore. The bigness of the world is redemption. Despair compresses you into a small space, and a depression is literally a hollow in the ground. To dig deeper into the self, to go underground, is sometimes necessary, but so is other route of getting out of yourself into the larger world, into the openness, in which you need not clutch your story and your troubles so tightly to your chest. Being able to travel both ways matters, and sometimes the way back into the heart of the question begins by going outward and beyond. This is the expansiveness that sometimes comes literally in a landscape. I told the students that they were at the age where they might begin to choose places that would sustain them the rest of their lives, that places were more reliable than human beings and longer lasting, and I asked them where they felt at home. They answered, each of them down the rows for an hour, the immigrants who had never stayed anywhere long and left a familiar world behind, the teenagers who'd left the home they'd spent their whole life in for the first time, the ones who loved or missed familiar landscapes, and the ones who'd never yet noticed them. So I wrote that, and then I wrote about the Nevada test site. It was a place that taught me to write. I'd begun going to the huge anti-nuclear actions at the Nevada test site, 60 miles north of Las Vegas in the late 1980s. The next years of camping and committing civil disobedience by trespassing onto this most bombed place on Earth, the site of more than 1,000 nuclear detonations that were only nominally tests, taught me other things as well. I think I'll go to the next slide for this. Oh, let's see if the clicker likes me better. Oh, wait. I've got this. Whoops, there we go. Let's go here. There we go. Okay. Yeah, great. So this is a map from the 2010 Atlas Infinite City called The Names Before the Names. I thought I did this atlas of 22 creative maps in collaboration with at least 36 people, most notably Leah Chandra, the head of design at UC Press. And UC Press kind of trusted I could do this thing I never did before that involved recruiting cartographers, writers, researchers, and artists. And most of all, working with the brilliant Leah, who instantly had smart ideas about how to make the maps beautiful, how to give the book an overall feel. But I talked to a guy at the Estuary Institute in San Francisco, Chuck Striplin, who's indigenous Ohlone, about my desire to map the shell mounds and the tech industry, which both ring San Francisco Bay. And he said, we don't really like people to map those, but there's this amazing research going on, putting together for the first time what the names of all the places were, or at least how, in a way, it had never been done before with indigenous research. I think with the Golden Gate National Recreation Areas, researcher Randy Milliken. And so they shared the research with us. We put it on a map. And it was really shocking in a wonderful way for me to see a place I've spent most of my life utterly unfamiliar again, because a few of the names, Napa, Sonoma, and Tamales, et cetera, are still on the contemporary maps, but so many of them are reminders that other people, this was somebody else's place with other languages, other stories, other worldviews before it was the place that I know, and I'm sure some of you know. So, and it was a outgrowth of a kind of long involvement with indigenous stories and how they change, for me, the ways we can conceptualize the world, how we respond to it, ideas that I think have made great inroads in the last 30 years, from where we were around the time of the quincentennial a great turning point. And and that first manifested in my book, Savage Dreams, named after an unfortunate title, named after James Savage, which I thought was clever and ironic at the time, the man who led the U.S. Army into Yosemite on a genocidal campaign in 1853. And I now realize that you should never have a book title only make sense around page 253. Take heed, graduate students. But, so, so, and and it was a place that taught me to write at the Nevada test site. Maybe the first thing that the very term place, maybe the first was that the very term place is problematic, implying a discrete entity, something you could put a fence around. And they did. 3 strands of barbed wire were around this 1,375 square mile high security area, but it didn't keep in the radiation or keep out the politics. What we mean by place is a crossroads, a particular point of intersection of forces coming from many directions and distances. At the Nevada test site, some of the more obvious convergences or collisions involve the history of civil disobedience since Thoreau and of physics since it became useful for atomic bombs, along with the Euro-American attitudes towards the desert that made it possible to devastate it so wantonly, and the counter-history of the indigenous people of the region. And during the decades of detonations, the radioactive fallout reached New England and beyond. Protesters came from Japan and then Kazakhstan, as well as from New York and rural Utah. So much for fences. The challenge of describing the austere sensuality of living out of doors in a harsh and possibly radioactive desert, under a spectacular sky, of doing so while contemplating the fate of the earth and playing tag with assorted armed security guards, called forth a great collapse of category for me. I realized that in order to describe the rich tangle of experience there, I needed to describe, to analyze, to connect, to critique, to evoke, and to report on both international politics and personal experience. That is, I needed to write as a memoirist and as a journalist and as a critic, and that these 3 voices were one voice in everything except the conventions that sort out our experience and censor what doesn't belong. I had been writing in 3 separate ways, 3 kinds of work. I was still quite young when I had the breakthrough, and it's why I say the Nevada test site taught me how to write. And and what it taught me was that I needed all the tools I had, and they all belonged together to evoke the complexity, density of experience, the many intersections coming together there. And so Savage Dreams came out of that. And the first half was about the Nevada test site that led me to get involved with the Western Shoshone Defense Project. The Western Shoshone elders who delightfully showed up and gave us permits to be there said, not only do we want our land back, we want the bombing to stop. So we formed these wonderful alliances, and I became a principal in the Defense Project, spending many weeks at a time for about 3 years on Mary and Carrie Dan's ranch in northeastern Nevada, and writing histories for them, ghostwriting for Carrie, and learned a lot. The second half of the book is about Yosemite. I'm not sure how it reads now when the world has changed so much, but I recognized through various sort of strokes of luck and random detours that it was what so much of the West and North America was then, somebody else's homeland reframed by whiteness as a virgin wilderness discovered by white people. And Yosemite was such a freaky place, one of the most visible places on earth, with 2 separate narratives contradicting each other and coexisting, one in which there was a Native history, but it was framed as somehow tailing off as though all the Native people had disappeared. Another one in which it was virgin wilderness, what the Wilderness Act of 1964 describes as a place in which man is only a visitor, which has always prompted me to joke, what about woman? And, but still, and the Native people of Yosemite Valley and the surrounding region had never gone away, but were invisible, ignored, written out in a kind of cultural genocide. And so the first half of the book is about the wars that take place. You know, they're both about invisible wars, the nuclear wars that weren't supposed to be happening yet, but happened for 40 years at the rate of a nuclear detonation a month. The second, the Indian wars that were supposed to have ended in the 19th century. and never stopped because the native people never went away. They just took other forms, mostly than the US Army. So, and I went back to Yosemite with my wonderful photographic collaborators I worked with multiple times, Byron Wolfe and Mark Klett, and because I'd written a book about Edward Muybridge and had been so intrigued by his strange, chaotic photographs of Yosemite, I think influenced by Darwinism's portrayal of a chaotic, kind of random world as it seemed to a lot of Victorians, and by the new obsession with glaciation and geology. And so we went to photograph Muybridge and realized that actually Muybridge, the other great 19th century landscape photographer there, Carleton Watkins, and the 20th century greats Ansel Adams and Edward Weston had all been there together, not together in time, but going to the same places in a huge place. And Yosemite National Park, like the Nevada test site, is about the size of Rhode Island. So what you're looking at in this picture is what Mark has been doing since the late 70s when he rephotographed the US Geological Survey with Joanna Verberg and Ellen Manchester in a project called the Rephotographic Project. He had trained as a geologist as an undergraduate and brought rephotography out of the sciences into art. So you see the big sepia picture is a Muybridge made in 1872. Through their incredible technical chops, Mark and Byron figured out that Edward Weston came halfway between our time in the early 21st century and Muybridge's time in 1872, stood 3 feet from where Muybridge stood and made the black and white picture you see that's sort of the middle distance. Ansel Adams came to the same vicinity and made the little picture sandwiched inside the Weston. And so these layers of time became an extraordinary thing for us to explore, to realize that time is not a river in which all things move forward, that some things hadn't changed at all, some things had become unrecognizable. We saw some of the same trees that Muybridge photographed and photographed them ourselves. And it made me hopeful because I saw how much Yosemite had changed and how it represented Native people and granting the Native people their rights, and the radically changed demographics of California and therefore the visitors to the park, maybe an end to the dominant, or at least a diffusion of the dominant white narrative. And of course, part of what denial of Native history had done is failed to recognize Native fire practices and that century of fire suppression that helped make our wildfires, along with climate change, so destructive, gave way to controlled burns. We remade a famous Ansel Adams photograph called Clearing Autumn Mist as clearing autumn smoke from a controlled burn, and had a lot of other adventures there. But that work with Native people, that rethinking of the landscape, that discovery of creation myths in which the world was never perfect and never fell from grace. It was always an improvisation and never finished. It gave me so much to help escape the sort of dominant culture, the white culture, the Eurocentric frameworks I had started out with. So, and you saw with the names before the names, this is actually a lot pinker in the original. Leah Chandra designed all the maps here, incidentally. Molly Roy was the cartographer on this one. Names have power. The names we give things are important. Well, I forgot to say, so Lake Tenaya has an indigenous name. It's Paiwiak. Part of what sparked the book Savage Dreams was this extraordinary encounter in which one of the invaders captured the tribal leader, Tenaya, and told him in one of those bizarre mixes of sentimentality and genocide the Victorians were so good at, your people will never live here again, but hey, we're going to name the lake after you. And Tenaya replied, it already has a name. And I found that so chilling and so resonant, the imposition of new names as though a place was blank, empty, had no history, could be reinvented by somebody who literally got there yesterday, versus it already has a name. So, so City of Women came about in the New York Atlas, which was the third and last, absolutely the last. Atlases are really hard work. Fundraising and managing, 40 or 50 people was a fun thing I will never, ever, ever do again. And but like almost all cities and places, most things in New York City are named after men, mostly powerful and prominent and wealthy white men. And I decided to fix that because with cartography, you can do anything. And it was so fun making maps too. I discovered that there's a particular kind of joy maps bring to people. I would bring people to visit the great map collector and scholar David Rumsey, and people would become kind of ecstatic, and then we'd see map joy with atlases as well. But so this is the New York subway, except that now all the stops are named after significant women who lived in New York, women of all colors, trans women, indigenous women, women from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And it was really exciting to redo this and to also to see people look at the map and say, huh, I'm gonna get on at Serena Williams and get off at Yoko Ono, and which you can do with this map. I instigated Emma Watson getting a London Underground map of this, also made as a City of Women, and Barcelona on International Women's Day this month introduced a Barcelona version of City of Women, so it keeps going. And, and I was invited by San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to propose a project for their 75th anniversary, and I proposed a series of broadside maps, and then ran across the bay to UC Press and said, but can we do this as a collaboration and do it as a book as well, because I believe all roads lead to books, or should. And that happened, and the Names Before the Names was the first map in the book. I was interested in two phenomena that I think are both in different kinds of trouble. One was actual, beautiful, complex maps as art as well as science, maps that tell you more than what your fucking phone shows you about how to get from point A to point B, and what Google Maps, with its incredibly dreary landmarking of commercial stuff, mostly food, and its erasure of everything else. So, and I had an extraordinary experience when I went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, a place I ended up spending a lot of time and writing about. I had a Garmin device. This was before smartphones thought they were so smart. And I had a gas station, 495 map. And I realized the more I used the map, the more the map was in me and I knew my way around and I didn't need a map, or I was the map. The more I used the Garmin device, nothing changed this 100th time. I just blindly obeyed it as I did the first time. I think there's a lot of people now who have no idea where they are, which you as geographers should all be booing right now. And and I wanted to celebrate what maps do, and to map things other than, transportation and retail on them, to show all the other things maps have done and can do. We worked with artists a lot to make some of the maps beautiful. You'll see some of those. And where were we? And so also, I wanted to celebrate cities, which I think through suburbanization and what I think of as the great withdrawal brought by the monsters of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, where people circulate less, explore less, navigate by winging it less, talk to strangers less, plus gentrification, et cetera, and a kind of suburbanization. I felt like cities were also in trouble. And so that list was really looking at like, what is it that cities give us? Why do cities matter? Why do maps matter? And I think it's partly a celebration, and I wanted to celebrate the coexistence, the infinite things that come together, the infinite ways you can see a city, et cetera. And of course, it's also very efficient to put at least two things on each map rather than devoting each map to one subject, although we did that with Names Before the Names and City of Women. This is a map about queer public spaces, which for many years in San Francisco were mostly bars. So there's a lot of bars there, and butterfly species. Mariposa in Spanish is a not particularly nice slang for gay men. But also San Francisco has a lot of endemic species. It's kind of a refuge for species and has been for human beings as well. I do get to say periodically, like, small, close-knit traditional communities are probably lovely, but I live in a city full of people those small, traditional, close-knit communities wanted to kill. And so, you know, Ben Peace did the cartography, Leah did the design, the artist Mona Caron did the art. A wonderful queer person living with AIDS fell in love with butterflies one day when um, um, swallowtail, an amazing, flew by, and he needed to know more about it. And he actually mapped the butterflies for me, just sketching on one of those very handy AAA or gas station maps. And I went into the archives of the gay and lesbian archives in San Francisco and read the old. There was a wonderful kind of fraternal organization for queer bars to survive, and it was a wonderful research project. And I discovered, although the gay history of San Francisco is very well known, there's an incredible lesbian history, and there are all these lesbian bars in North Beach that are so much more interesting than the beat poet history. That's what most people know. We're interested in resuscitating lost histories. This is where SF MoMA is located in a shiny new hotel and convention district that used to be a whoops, come back you. Where did it go? It used to be a working class district where all the longshoremen and dock workers lived, particularly the retired ones. And they fought the fiercest battle in redevelopment and gained some concessions, but including permanent senior housing complexes. But the neighborhood was erased, so we rebuilt it on a map. And this is a map that was something of a failure because I let somebody put way too much junk on there. Less is more for a lot of maps. Oops, and it's, whoops, these maps are jumping. I might be touching something, but I didn't think I was. But I was fascinated, and this maps the Norteño and Sureño gang territories in the Mission. I was amused that the Norteños are south of the Sureños. If you don't speak Spanish, Norteño is northerners, Sureños is southerners. And fascinated also by these kids whose parents had often had these incredible immigrant journeys, the dangerous kind that undocumented people have, walking 3 days across the desert, etc. But a lot of the kids hadn't even been to Ocean Beach that I'd shown you, or to Golden Gate Park. They lived in this incredibly dense local neighborhood. I asked my friend Adriana Camarena, a lawyer from Mexico City, to write the essay. Her first draft was 50,000 words. But she got drawn into the neighborhood, became very involved in police shootings in the neighborhood, and still is. And so it became another kind of set of great relationships that emerged from the project. So, and this is from the New York Atlas called oops, they are so jumpy. I swear I'm not touching anything. This is called Mother Tongues in Queens, since the most linguistically diverse place on earth is New York City, mostly because of Queens. More than 800 languages are spoken in Queens, and it's another example of coexistence. That New York Atlas, the last one, came out just before the 2016 election that some of you may remember, although it was several thousand years ago. Perhaps a geologist can name how many eons have passed. And I was like, what are we doing with this atlas? What is this about? And I wrote an essay in the form of a letter to Donald Trump saying, Dear Donald Trump, I don't know if you've ever been to New York City, but I recommend it strongly. All the bad things that you think would happen if there was a lot of queer people who were treated with rights and respect, if there were a lot of Muslims, including New York City's 7,000 Muslim police people, you know, if there were a lot of immigrants and a lot of languages and et cetera, all happening in New York, and it's the envy of the world. For this one, we worked with Endangered Language Institute and Joshua Jelly Shapiro, a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley, my amazing collaborator on all three atlases and co-director of the New York one. His partner, Marissa, did the photographs on it of all these different language signs, et cetera. And the Endangered Language Alliance was so happy with what we did. They went and did language maps for the other boroughs too. And then this is from the New Orleans Atlas, Lead and Lies. Part of it was we needed to do a map in a hurry. We had wanted to map the Vietnamese in New Orleans, and they had run out of time to get it done. And this was something I thought about a lot. We borrowed a very good map of lead contamination. You can see the lead densities in New Orleans, and like other cities you know about, it's had a huge impact. on the health, particularly of poor people of color, particularly on children there. And I was like, what would I pair with it? I decided to collect a lot of lies told about New Orleans. And I wrote, we pretend truth is a solid continent, but untruth is a marshy territory. There are myths and legends, harmless lies about whether my roux is as good as your grandmother's, and there are noble lies. We saw no fugitives pass this way, and truths told by other means. New Orleans' most famous jazzman, Louis Armstrong, changed his birthday to the 4th of July, 1900, to make his identity and that of his country somehow consonant. And they are, even though he was born August 4th, 1901. When power tells lies to the people, though, it's another thing altogether. And New Orleans, as a part of the Confederacy, as a place with a very grim racial history, a slave history, etc., has a long history of the other kind of lies. Slavery as a beneficent institution, lies about the Confederacy, about the causes of the Civil War, etc. So New Orleans also registers unusually high levels of lead, both from pre-1978 paint and pre-1986 leaded gasoline, though the amounts of lead are not evenly distributed. Lead is a versatile but vicious substance. It accumulates slowly and subtly, rarely detected until the dose is damaging. The substance is a calcium analog. That is, lead impersonates calcium, lying to the body about what it is and insinuating itself into places where benign calcium belongs. Like a lie, it gets to its victim to accept harm by disguising it. This is what lead and lies have in common. They are destroyers that remain unseen and are more destructive because of their invisibility. So, and this is one of the all-time, whoops. Now it's going backwards. Oh, there's a reason for that. Buttons. This is one of our most beloved. It's all good. I think I figured it out, but it's hard because the talk is partly overlapping the keyboard here. This is a map of bounce music, the origins of twerking, but just and one of New Orleans is the great musical font of the continent, the place because the slaves were allowed to continue their cultural practices on Sundays, particularly in Congo Square. African music survived and became the source of most popular music in this continent. And our friend Garnett Cadigan, who's from Jamaica, came to Tulane on a scholarship, and he wrote the essay for this map. And he's a beautiful writer, beautiful thinker, beautiful friend. And he said, a few months after Hurricane Katrina, I returned to the city and visited some of my old stomping grounds. And he found, of course, that all the housing projects had been shut down. And they did this bunch of kind of neoliberal attacks on the city, turning schools into charter schools, closing down the public housing projects, many of which were huge and historic and et cetera. So he found that the housing projects were shuttered and would be torn down. He said bounce parties were happening all over the city. It was at these shindigs at home and abroad that one would hear the shout-outs to housing projects that had been depopulated, closed, or razed. It was there that a performer would sing song, Magnolia's in the building, and everyone would demonstrate the potency of the past by singing, from Magnolia to the Melpomene to the Calliope, a roll call of the three most famous and honored housing projects in the city, places where many, if not most, of the celebrants no longer lived. Psychological record keeping with a thrilling beat. Turns out that Bounce answered the question, where did the projects go? They found a home in song. It was almost kind of like the song lines of the Mojave Desert and Australia, these kind of survivals in song of what was gone. And so this is another not that successful map where I was obsessed with Congo Square, the music that survived. We were making the atlas right after the Arab Spring, and hip hop played a crucial role in the Arab Spring, which could have been called mostly the North African Spring. that music that came that came from Africa to New Orleans to the Bronx, we actually mapped the birth of hip hop in the Bronx as the Bronx was burning down through landlord arson and related monstrosities, and then went global and went back to Africa. It was such a fascinating circulation over centuries that I tried to map it. I'm not sure how well I did, but there it is. And I'm really interested in spatial justice. I was so thrilled that this conference was focused on it. So thrilled to be working with Farhana Sultana in our climate book and to go to some of her panels. And you can see with the questions of place names, with the erasure of indigenous people and names and memories, with some of the other contested things in the places I've talked about, that spatial justice is something that really runs through my work. And I actually wrote an editorial during the pandemic, and because Marin County, the affluent county north of San Francisco I grew up in, decided that nobody should drive to nature. Only people who lived in proximity to it would be allowed to go there. And of course, it's segregated like most places are, where a lot of affluent people live very close to the huge amounts of public land in the county. Sonoma County and San Mateo County made similar calls, not quite as restrictive. And of course, poor people live, much more inside the developed world, and unless they were very good runners or cyclists, didn't have access to it. So it shut out the people who don't live in big houses, don't have big yards from nature. And I wrote a editorial denouncing it in the LA Times about that conflict over access to space, which the county has also restricted by creating half of Mount Tamalpais State Park has rich people's houses with no parking zones all around them, so the trailheads are also only for the extremely rugged and the extremely local. And, but this actually comes from something Dick Walker wrote about in his book, The Country and the City, about the women who I'd known about but nobody had really written about. Huge amounts of public land in the Bay Area are protected. We have a vast green belt, vast amounts of state, county, and national parks, and also, watersheds protected and stuff like that. And a lot of it was protected in the post-war era into the 70s by what I call the green women, these women who campaigned tirelessly for decades to create all these areas. So the artist Huda Andrade created the ornamental border, because I love 19th century maps, ornamental borders, and we used, I forget whose map, of the actual territory. And so, so that was, City of Women was also for me about whose city is it? Who is safe to walk down the street? I showed that map when I was guest teaching at Columbia to a group of students. And two of the responses just really chilled and amazed me. I asked them, what would it mean to you to live in a city where everything was named after powerful women? And one of them said to me, and they're both young women of color, on a boulevard named after famous women, would a man dare sexually harass me? Another said, in a city named after great women, I would stand up straight. She'd had bad posture all her life. And I felt myself how different my life might have been growing up in a place where things were named after women. New York City, until a few decades ago, literally only had one statue of a woman. Joan of Arc, burned at the stake, not particularly the most encouraging role model, although armor and horses, very exciting for girls like me when they were young. And then it had five when I wrote this City of Women essay. It has a few more now, very few things named after women. And the research on these projects has been so exciting. I didn't realize that I lived in what I call a manscape, and we all do, until we worked on the map. And I realized, yeah, everything everywhere is named after men. I know the Paris Metro looked at changing a few names, and other cities have as well. So I'm interested in spatial justice around naming, whether it's Lake Tenaya, the return of original names like Mount Denali in Alaska, at and the politics of access to green space, who's safe to walk, etc., whose stories are told, and that was. So this is another map from the first atlas showing um, there was a huge influx of Black people to the Bay Area during World War II, coming for the jobs, mostly in the shipyards, and escaping Jim Crow since they mostly came from the South. Josh did the research for this map, Joshua Jelly Shapiro, and it was really kind of shocking to me to realize that huge portions of the Black community still lived in the places they moved to for the shipyard jobs that died up when World War II ended. I feel sometimes like those shipyards could be a model for what we need to do for climate change. The Bay Area built a warship a day for 1,000 days in the war, and not that they made one ship in a day, but we produced 1,000 ships in 1,000 days. You know, electrification needs that kind of energy. But Black people, through redlining and other kinds of discrimination, including economic discrimination of other kinds, ended up in Richmond, West Oakland, Hunters Point, Bayview, and the projects in Sausalito, Marin City, all that, you know, many of them ever after for generations. So this is a map we thought was really successful. One of the fascinatingly weird things about mapping New Orleans and Louisiana is the most basic distinction most maps make is between water and land. And New Orleans, as you all know, is a place full of marshes and bayous and wetlands and swamps and disintegration. But we decided to map the Gulf because the oil industry is, you know, we wanted to map the region, and the oil industry has a huge impact there. And also, not only do the maps not show what New Orleans actually looks like, you can see the sort of peninsular tip, which is actually the fastest eroding land on Earth. Most maps are out of date and make it look solid, but it's actually just falling apart fast, partly because of all the pipelines run through it. And so we wanted to map the pipelines and the platforms. We didn't even have room to map all the things the oil industry does. Most maps will make it look like pristine landscape, but, you know, like it's the same waterscape it was 500 years ago, but it's a completely industrialized space, you know. And I wanted to end talking a bit about climate, although I know I've gone a bit over, and more or less. I think I go till another 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, amazing. So this was for the New York, obviously, the New York thing, where we mapped the carbon footprint of people in the various neighborhoods, and you can see the correlation between wealth and climate footprint. Even if people are living in high-rise and taking public transit, they're also, you know, they've got those second homes and the jets and all the rest. And Danielle Alcala Cohen worked on this with us and wrote us a beautiful essay. And my own work has moved much more to focus on, and I was always talking, like the last 20 years, I've been paying attention to and incorporating climate change a lot, but now I'm fully focused on it. And and I wrote recently, every crisis is in part a storytelling crisis. This is as true of climate chaos as anything else. We are hemmed in by stories that prevent us from seeing or believing in or acting on the possibilities for change. Some are habits of mind, some are industry propaganda. Sometimes the situation has changed, but the stories haven't, and people follow the old versions like outdated maps into dead ends. We need to leave the age of fossil fuel behind swiftly and decisively, but what drives our machines won't change until we change what drives our ideas. The visionary organizer, Adrienne Marie Brown, wrote not long ago that there is an element of science fiction in climate action. We are shaping the future we long for and have not yet experienced. I believe that we are in an imagination battle, she says. A climate story we urgently need is one that exposes who is actually responsible for climate chaos. It's been popular to say that we are all responsible, But Oxfam recently reported that over the past 25 years, the carbon impact of the wealthiest 1% of human beings was twice that of the poorest 50%. So responsibility for the impact and the capacity to make change is currently distributed very unevenly. And more than the carbon footprints here, this is a map just of inequality. Daniel also pointed out beautifully that the most climate adapted places in New York City are mostly the housing projects and various decisions about scale and resources they've made. And I wrote, there's yet another narrative that's persisted at least since the invention of compact fluorescent light bulbs in the Toyota Prius, that we must renounce abundance and enter an age of austerity to respond to climate change, which also assumes that all of us are living in an age of abundance, which is very untrue of people. The 8 million people a year who die of particulate air pollution, mostly from fossil fuels worldwide, the people whose land has been destroyed from Ecuador to Nigeria, by oil extraction, I could also say to Alberta to New Mexico, the people living next to refineries that contaminate their air, all of us facing climate chaos. So, and Thelma and I in our new book, Not Too Late, try and stand that on its head and say we live in an age of austerity, of hope, of community, of justice, of social connectedness, of time, etc. And the things the climate crisis requires us to do could usher in an age of abundance of all these things, depending on who is in charge, how we do it, etc. It's all in the telling. To consider our age an age of abundance, you have to be counting sheer accumulated stuff and ignore how it's distributed. That is, we live in an age of extreme wealth for some and desperation for the many. But there's another way to count wealth and abundance as hope for the future, safety and public confidence, emotional well-being, including the young who are now so filled with climate anxiety, grief, despair, and so being so pounded by the doomers. So love and friendship and strong social networks. And I think also relationships, including relationships to the natural world. So meaningful and purposeful lives, equality and justice and inclusion. So I'm ending with an image by my brother David, who Bill McKibben calls an artivist, a mashup of artist and activist. He's one of the great image makers for the climate movement. We have a running joke between us, or at least I think it's funny, that I have more words than he does at 26 books and counting, but his words are bigger because he's the guy who can do you a 300-foot banner for a demonstration and or make the signs that will be used all over the continent in a climate demo. And this is the idea of a climate toolbox. He created a kind of Swiss Army knife of equipping ourselves to respond to the great challenge we face. And finally, one of the reasons it's exciting to be with geographers is because so many of you are addressing climate, are looking at justice, adaptation, the stories we tell, changing the stories. Some of you are IPCC authors, etc. And everybody has a role in responding to the crisis. And there are so many things that need doing, so many people doing it so beautifully. So thank you to all of you doing it. Thank you to the AAG. Thank you, geographers, cartographers, and geography. And thank you, all you listeners.
So though we went over, I think we still have the room. We'll take a few questions, just a few, but I think a lot of people are also anxious to have Rebecca inscribe their books. She'll be doing that in the back of the room. And so Rebecca, will you take a few questions?
I would love to.
Okay.
And yeah, I did go over. I love those maps.
I just
get me
discovered
going.
something wonderful. I go to people, so just raise your hand.
Ha, they're fleeing like it was the Titanic.
Hi, my name is
Hello.
Emily. Thank you so much for your talk. We're all very excited that you're here. So us as geographers, I feel like a lot of people in the room can relate to this, that we take creative approaches to very heavy problems. So I was wondering if you had any advice for young geographers in addressing these issues in creative ways. And also if you're facing like writer's block or design barriers, if you have any advice on how to, yeah, just get over that. Thank you.
I missed a little bit of it because the sound quality is so poor, but advice, just the advice part again, please.
Yeah, so many of us just work with like really heavy topics. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if you had any advice for how we can address this and making it more accessible to other audiences.
It's something I've written about a lot. Writing about hope for me is writing about the resilience and to face the things we need to face. I actually always think that so much in this culture tells us we can hide from them or they're overwhelming, but facing them is also often emotionally the best way to face them. A writer friend of mine pointed out that the word encouragement means, to instill courage. And so I've written a lot trying to encourage people to engage with politics, to engage with climate, with issues of justice. And my book, Hope in the Dark, is about trying to change the frameworks in which I find that a lot of despair, depression, et cetera, comes from frameworks that are often not, well, with climate outside, in the kind of larger world are often not based on accurate assessment of the facts, but also not always based on assessments of where does power lie, how does change work, what kind of power do we have, what does change look like. I'm a huge fan of indirect consequences. I see a lot of people thinking, that if results don't happen instantly, there are no results, therefore what we did didn't matter. Not looking at indirect consequences, long-term consequences, the slow build of something that happens suddenly, like a revolution or an uprising, the way that changing the story can feel like a very metaphysical, cultural thing, but it can end up changing policy and therefore the lives of people in big ways. And looking backwards to the huge amounts of change in my lifetime. And, it's not that, what I started saying around climate is that we live in a world that was unimaginable 50 years ago. The world of 2073 is absolutely unimaginable. But all the good things in the world we live in now, around human rights, around the environment, around changing ideas, come from work people did, usually without knowing if and how and when they would succeed. So I also feel that the spirit in which we act is important, and finding the stories from the past that can model, okay, these people face these difficult things and they got the refineries next to the schools banned, or they got marriage, they passed marriage equality, or, they gained reproductive rights in Mexico and Spain, or, they toppled the regime. That, for me, I'm historically minded. The stories from the past are also really helpful in facing the absolute unknowability of the future. And I'll just end by saying, end that question by saying, I also find that there's a weird tendency in this country of people to pretend we know what the future holds, which is, either blind optimism that everything will be fine, therefore we need to do nothing, or it's all doomed, that the future has somehow already been decided and there's nothing we can do. Both those things lead to passivity. I think the future is, there are parameters, but within those parameters, we're making huge decisions, particularly in this decade, particularly with climate, decisions that will matter for thousands of years. And it behooves us to face them and do the things that need to be done as wholeheartedly as we can. So a lot of my climate work now is just to be, the queen of encouragement. In a realistic way, I hope. So, other questions?
Thank you. I'll read 2 lines from Louise Erdrich's book, The Night Watchman. Things started going wrong as far as Zanat was concerned when places everywhere were named for people and not for the real things that happened in these places. This confusion of the Chinu Komanag between the timelessness of the earth and the short span here of mortals was typical of their arrogance. What do you think of this idea that our response to the naming of so many places, having men's names, names of conquerors and the like, we shouldn't name places after people at all, perhaps?
I think that there are places where it makes sense and buildings where, because there's also buildings and things named after people, but I think the current status of names is pretty horrible. It's actually one of the ways in which I feel that we're living in a more or less revolutionary eras. After a revolution, like when the Irish threw the English out, they took down statues, they changed names. I can't remember what it was before, but the Great Boulevard in Dublin became O'Connell Street after the liberator Daniel O'Connell. And when Black Lives Matter started taking down statues of Christopher Columbus, and then in Europe, people started taking down King Ludwig and slave profiteers and et cetera, as well as all the Confederates. That's what happens in a revolution. And the names are changing, and from college campuses to Mount Denali, I don't even want to say the name now, one of the biggest ski resorts in California changed its name to something pretty anodyne, but at least it's not a ugly indigenous slur for women anymore. And so I think it matters a lot. And the Lake Tenaya thing demonstrated one way I think it matters, City of Women, another way that it matters. And I think that the era we're in, that the renaming is a not insignificant and exciting part of what's happening. I can't pronounce it yet, so I won't say it, but the fact that New Zealand is the biggest thing thinking of changing its name, and a lot of people are now speaking as though it is now. I will have to hear somebody else say it out loud a few times before I dare. But back to the Maori name, I think is extraordinary. There are a lot of indigenous names in this country, including of states, the Nebraskas and Missouris, Mississippis, et cetera. But I think that there's room to change a lot of names. And I find it just so dreary when like one of the Sierra Nevada is named after some annoying white guy. I find the Spanish saints across California a little more pleasant, although, they're equally arbitrary. I did a map, the first map I ever commissioned, I worked with a cartographer named Bart Wright during an anti-immigration period in the mid-90s to create an English-only California map, but California had to be in brackets because it's a Spanish name. This was during English-only language initiatives, and you lose San Francisco and San Jose and Sacramento and Los Angeles and all the saints and a lot of the rivers, and you lose the Sierra Nevada, et cetera. So I think it's more important, and I think it can be transformative. I know land acknowledgements are often thought of as performative, not, et cetera, but I think just the recognition, which was nowhere to be found in mainstream culture, that indigenous people were here, in most cases they are still here one way or another, and that this place had peoples and names before Europeans and Euro-Americans, before settler colonialism, is really powerful. I think it's changed the collective imagination profoundly. So names have power. I'm with Ursula K. Le Guin on that.
The Night Watchman is a great book. Please buy it. We probably have time for one more question because I want to also give us a chance to have books signed. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. I thought it was wonderful. I have a question about the process about pairing things which often seem either contradictory or totally unrelated to each other. One of the things I love so much about your work, and particularly the maps, is pairing things which you just wouldn't think would be in conversation with each other. And so I'm just curious about that process. At what point do you find these things are an obvious connection and should be drawn cartographically or another way, or at what point do you think, oh, these two things actually don't work together? And also linking that to Orwell and Roses, which I just think is such a cool concept. So I'd love to hear more.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted, to make maximum use of the real estate of the map by putting, more than one thing on it, but also to suggest that cities are, what I love about cities, and as the rural America gets more and more scary, cities become more and more clearly refuges for trans people, BIPOC people, et cetera. But I wanted to celebrate cities as places of coexistence, and some of them weren't immediately obvious, monarchs and queens, and I sort of unpacked how I see San Francisco as a refuge, a city of refuge. It has been a place where people feel much safer to be queer or trans, and it is a place, not that we've taken great care of them overall, but of a lot of rare and endemic species, some extinct like the brown satyr butterfly, some still hanging on like the blue, like the mission blue butterfly. And that was fun because butterflies are mostly in green space. The queer public spaces were mostly, developed spaces. But, like we did brownstones and basketballs in Brooklyn. We did, trying to think of some of the other pairings. And they, it was a collaborative project in retrospect. I think some of them don't work as well as others do. But the most basic thing was always to talk about coexistence. And the first atlas was called Infinite City. I probably should have said after Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, but also because a city exists in more or less infinite versions. If San Francisco has 800,000 people, and each of them has many maps within them of, how they get around and where their experiences have been and where people look like them and where people don't look like them, where they feel safe and where they don't, then, just in the heads of the 800,000 inhabitants, you're talking many millions of maps. So also to suggest in a way that cities can be mapped in innumerable ways because so many things are coexisting there and, that it's inexhaustible. And it felt also like a climate, the epigraph to the first atlas was Thoreau's, "I have traveled widely and conquered," a classic Thoreau tongue-in-cheek declaration from a guy who did travel a little but refused to go to Europe and stuff. It felt like in the age of climate change, learning to discover unknown worlds and strangeness and broaden your horizons without leaving town was kind of a great thing to do. And so the atlases were also about broadening that way. And it was fun for me because I've been in San Francisco since I was 18 and the Bay Area since I was 5 with a few intermissions. And to find out how little of that, I probably hadn't been to a third of San Francisco at that point or maybe more. And I still discover things all the time. So just to encourage all those things. And thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the patient attendance. And thank you all. I'll go scribble in books if you're so inclined to get me to scribble in one. And thank you, booksellers, as well.